Okay, so we'll pretend it's working. We're dealing with Chapter 9, Land Degradation, right now. When you guys hear the phrase land degradation, what do you think about?
Loss of topsoil.
Loss of topsoil, that's one of the topics we're going to get to. Erosion.
Deforestation.
Deforestation is a big topic we're going to get to.
Housing development.
So conversion of land into other things, into human developed land. We'll talk about that a little bit. Yeah. Drought. We will mention the concepts of drought, and with drought, also desertification, as land moves from one type of land type towards becoming a desert, which is going to bring up a topic called soil salinization. So the process through which soil becomes salty. And we're going to go through a number of these different types of topics. But why do you think you should care about land degradation? Why does this matter? So we might be completely ruining land, and I think for all of us, that's a bad thing. Just from the perspective of losing an ecosystem is bad, but also losing the services that that ecosystem provides for us is also bad.
Well, I was just going to say it's like directly linked to sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
If we're losing those ecosystems and those services, then we're not going to be able to sustain.
Absolutely. So human life depends upon having land that is usable for us, but also for everything else that needs to be there. Anything else you can think about why this is a really bad topic?
I think in terms of agriculture, which goes along with what we were just saying, but if you can't grow food, the soil is degraded.
If we can't grow food, we can't eat, and we're not going to be here very long at all. And perhaps one of the things that's difficult about a few of these topics is that we're really lucky in where we live in the United States. We are really blessed to be in an ecosystem that has not seen the amount of extremes of this that have been seen elsewhere in the world. And also because we live in a more developed country, we are not finding ourselves exploiting our land at the same rate that we're finding in some other countries. We're exploiting the land. So land degradation is a local issue. You all kind of already touched on that, but not entirely a local issue. So in an area where it happens, it's incredibly a local issue. And there's a concern, what if we can't grow enough food now? Or what if we don't have enough forest left in order to support the animals that we hunt for food? It does become a local issue. But it's also a global issue. When we clear cut a rainforest, there's a lot of different things that happen. One is we lose species. 2 is we lose valuable topsoil. 3, we usually end up doing slash and burn and burning it and creating a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. 4, you lose the ability of those trees to take and sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And by sequestering, I mean that they're going to take it and incorporate it into their biomass and hold on to it. All of our ecosystems, whether we want them to be or not, are interconnected. Changes in one can affect the other. Have you heard about the butterfly effect before? It's this concept that if a butterfly flaps its wings in one area, it can cause a hurricane someplace else. So one change in one place can eventually result to a massive change elsewhere. Now, How many of you think a butterfly flapping its wings can cause a hurricane? I'm going to throw something else to you. La Nina and El Nino, do they affect our weather? Absolutely. Where do they occur? South Pacific, from the coast, northwestern coast of South America, over across the South Pacific towards Indonesia and India. And it's about the balance of heat in that portion of the ocean. When things are correctly balanced, it is warmer on the side of Indonesia than it is off the coast of South America. And we find that that actually changes the balance of the height of the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean, with it higher in the areas where it's warmer and lower in the areas where it's cooler. What it results in for the people living in India and Indonesia is your monsoon climate, the normal climate that they have. But when the process breaks down, we can have an equal distribution of heat, which actually changes the weather patterns for everyone worldwide, especially if it's a strong event. And when the heat is pushed over to South America, we get extreme events that can determine whether or not we get a winter with storms that can drop 3 feet of snow in 2 days. It's strange to think that our weather is affected by the heat distribution of the South Pacific Ocean. But it is. And our ecosystems are interconnected in so many other ways. Land degradation matters because we need air, we need water, we need resources to survive. We need the ecosystem services. Impacts on global climate change are related to land degradation. And in turn, climate change is going to degrade land. Whether it is through sea level rise or through the changing patterns of rainfall, we're going to see that land degradation is directly a result of climate change. And then people have to migrate from degraded areas. If you can't grow food in an area and you can't afford to bring it in, you're going to have to move someplace else where you can afford food. If there's no topsoil left to do agriculture, you have to go someplace where there is topsoil or bring it in. So it makes the cost of living more expensive, or it makes people leave. I think you're all familiar with the concept of a biome, and that we have major types of world biomes on Earth. Did we cover this at all in ecology for those of you that had this? Okay, so this should be basically review for you. And that each of the biomes has different types of soils. Each biome has a characteristic climate. And because of the soil types and the climate, you get characteristic plants and animals. If we were to do a large classification of biomes, we would find that we have 3: forests, grasslands, and deserts. Of those 3, what do we live in? Should we take a vote? How many of you say desert? It's good, we're definitely not in a desert. How many of you think we're in a grassland? How many of you think we're in a forest? Congratulations, you are all correct. We live in a forest. Deciduous, temperate. And we can look at how biomes move as we go, or where the distribution of different biomes is. The biomes themselves don't move, but how the distribution changes as we move from hot to cold and wet to dry. So if you're looking at a area where we live today, we're in that kind of warm and wet, temperate, deciduous forest. We probably don't tend to think of our climate as warm, though, but at sometimes in the year we are remarkably warm. At others, well, today's relatively warm. Last week had some pretty cold days. And did you hear that we have a chance of snow tonight? Not much, but we have 2 more chances for snow in the next week. And the potential for one of them to be large, maybe? Maybe? And this is another way of looking at the distribution, where you're able to see which ones are found where worldwide. And where would you characterize the deserts as being found? Around approximately what area of the world? Longitude and latitude wise. Or at least longitude wise. Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn. They're right around the 30 degrees north and south of the equator marks. It is not showing a desert for South America, but they do have the tropical dry forest that some of them kind of fringe upon desert-like. I'm hoping this is a review for all of you. But soil is truthfully the most overlooked part of an ecosystem. I think it's pretty safe to say. And how many of you think soil is not alive? Oh, it's kind of messy, right? Soil contains a lot of things that are not alive, but it also contains living things. The way we tend to think of soil is as dirt. The dirt portion is not alive, but if you're with geologists at any point in time and you refer to soil as dirt, they're going to get really angry very fast. It's soil. Soil is a mixture of rock particles, decaying plant and animal matter, water and air in the pore spaces, and then organisms. But organisms like what? Bacteria.
Mycorrhizomes.
The mycorrhizomes, so the fungi. Archaea, perhaps.
Yeah.
Viruses. Are viruses alive, Matt?
It's an open debate.
Nematodes. Worms. Insects. All sorts of things are going to live in and around the soil. Some of them on plant roots, some of them not, some of them in charge of decay, others just entirely spending their entire life within the soil. The rock particles, well, it's going to depend upon what type of soil you're looking at, what type of rock it's full of. And the decaying matter and the organisms are going to regulate the nutrient cycles of the soil. So the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the carbon, the silica, the sulfur cycles are all going to be regulated by the organisms that are living in it. The soil supports plant growth. The healthier your topsoil, generally speaking, the healthier your plant community is going to be. The soil will also regulate water. In areas with healthy soil, the soil helps to control flooding by absorbing a lot of water. We find that the soil types between deserts and rainforests are going to vary dramatically in their ability to take in water. In an area that gets a lot of rain, the soil is capable of bringing in lots of rain and of holding on to it. Desert soils are not capable of doing that. How many of you have ever been out to Arizona? Anybody? Do you remember seeing a lot of wash areas? So the roads will dip down into these wide, which look like large stream beds.
Yeah, I did. So I was mostly in Nevada, but at one point we drove out into Arizona, and I remember there being like weird things with the road. I was in And I was like, what is happening here? What is with this weird place?
Yeah, my dad's family all lives out in Tucson, Arizona, and they have wash areas in the roads where those floodwaters are directed during a large rainstorm. And there's signs at the wash areas, if it's raining, do not drive through. Because you know how you've all seen it at some point in time, the people on the news that are like, I can drive my car through that puddle. I've got this. And suddenly that puddle is like 3 feet of water and their car gets stuck and there's the firemen rescuing them. That's not a big problem in the desert. Because when you drive through what looks like a small puddle, it's usually a flood. And your car just goes right down, flood water. So they have to rescue you usually some other way. But it's because their soil doesn't hold water. So as soon as it starts raining, it starts flooding. And within, they say, my cousin Holly said that within sometimes like 6 minutes, it can go from like, oh, that's a nice downpour to, oh my gosh, look, the rivers are starting to build. So not always that fast, but if it's a pounding rainstorm, you're talking well within a half hour, you have standing water moving. And it only takes 6 inches of water to move a car. That's why we never drive through large puddles while it's raining when you don't know how deep the puddle actually is. Our soil is also a very large carbon sink. Are you familiar with the term a carbon sink or a carbon source? So in ecology, when we talk about sinks and sources, a sink is where things are held onto or where they're stored, and a source is where they're released from. So something that is a carbon sink is where carbon can be stored over a long period of time. And in soil, it is stored in the roots, it is stored in the decaying matter, it is stored in the... And your soil might look something like this. As we move from immature to mature soil, we decrease in the amount of rock and increase in the amount of topsoil and biotic organisms, at least diversity of biotic organisms that are there. It also changes the types of plants that can be found growing in the soil. Trees need a place for their roots. So immature soil is not going to support trees very well because there's no room for the roots to grow. If any of you want to know more about the insects living in the soil, I'd say definitely talk with Dr. Dubé. He has much more of a background in nematode and insect populations in soil than I do. I could handle some of the bacterial questions about soil because I've worked on bacteria in sandy soil areas before. And the last big topic before we're going to look at a couple of our biomes very quickly is the concept of biodiversity and ecosystems. Which biomes have the greatest types of biodiversity? Tropical. And if you had to pick one particular biome, which one would it be? Tropical rainforest? You might be right. Sometimes there's a kind of question whether or not it's a tropical rainforest or because we tend to think about land biomes, whether it's an estuary or a coral reef, because coral reefs and estuaries can have similar numbers of biodiversity to tropical rainforests, or at least, and also similar amounts of load of biological organisms. So biodiversity deals with the variety of species, but also the variety of genetics and the variety of ecosystem and biome types in an area. And genetics does matter because if you want to have a sustainable ecosystem, you need to have a high level of genetic diversity. The biodiversity provides us with food, provides us with fibers, and by that I mean cotton, wood products, things that we use in making the things that we use every day. It provides us with energy, with medicine. How does the biodiversity play a role in air and water quality? How do trees help with air quality?
They filter carbon dioxide.
Filter carbon dioxide.
They take out like toxins and stuff.
Some of them can take out other things, yeah. So they will help to decrease the amount of toxins in the air. How about water quality?
Same thing with like the roots reaching into like streams and stuff.
And arguably the most important ecosystem types when it comes to water quality are wetlands, which would include salt marshes and mangroves in them, because they are capable of reducing massive quantities of nutrients and pollutants that move through. As a matter of fact, some of them are capable of incorporating into their, for lack of a better term, body system, I guess it works, plant body system, heavy metals and toxins, and they're able to store them in ways that it doesn't affect their life, but allows us to detoxify things like human waste. Biodiversity plays a role in soil fertility. We've done experiments to find out what the best way is to fertilize soil. And sometimes it's growing different crops together, or growing one crop in an area first and the next year growing another. This decreases the amount of fertilizer you have to add and increases the fertility of the soil. But biodiversity is impacted by our disturbance on the ecosystem. You're familiar with the terms biotic and abiotic? Things that are alive versus things that cannot be living. I make the big distinction cannot be living because I don't want to say dead, because dead matter is still biotic because it was alive. And energy flows while nutrients cycle. And finally, the concepts of producers, consumers, and decomposers. But I figure that's all review for you guys. We can look at our types of forests and the services that the forests provide, because forests dominate 30% of the land surface. So about a third of our land surface is forest. That makes them very important. Also, we tend to live in forested areas because forests supply us with a lot. What do we get from forests? Give me some ideas. Building material. Maple syrup.
Timber.
Timber.
And like my hometown is like known for its paper factory, so like that's what all the land around us is used for.
So paper, building supplies, wood for fires. What were you saying?
I was saying paper.
Paper.
This is fine food.
Food. What kind of food comes from a forest?
Deer.
Deer.
Not a
Almonds.
forest, but trees.
Trees give us a lot of different fruits and nuts. This is a plantation. It's an olive plantation. Is that a forest? Yes. It's not a natural forest, but it's a forest. If a forest is an area of land covered by trees, this does in fact fit the definition of a forest. Forests also provide us with ecosystem services. We talked a little bit about that, but there are three main divisions of forests. We have old growth, second growth, and plantation. So plantation is a managed stand or a managed forest of trees. What's the difference between old and second growth? Because I know you covered this in ecology.
It's only old growth like never been cut.
So old growth are the ones that we have not forested. The second growth are the ones that have regrown after we have cut them down. Are there any old growth forests in Pennsylvania? One. There's one all the way out west near the Carnegie Mellon. It's a very interesting, different type of, it has trees that were around during the American Revolution that are still standing, that were adult trees then. I think it's in the Allegheny. We went to it for one of my conservation bio classes. We had full weekend field trips. Like, we left on Thursday nights and came back on Sunday nights when I was an undergrad for that course. And I think because it's like a 6-hour drive, so you would need more than a day. But it was very interesting because what we're used to with like these distinct understories was not really there. It was very tall trees and ferns. It was a very different type of forest than I'm used to. So we have our 3 major divisions of forest. Then we have our 3 major climate types. Tropical, temperate, and cold. What divides the climate for these areas is precipitation and temperature. Tropical. How would you rate their temperature? Hot. And the rainfall? Plentiful. Lots, usually about 200 centimeters of rain a year or more. I know, something like that. It's like 190 something. I forget what the threshold is. 193 maybe? It's a strange number. Temperate. How would you describe our temperature climate-wise? Warm summers, cold winters, and our rainfall is about average. For us in Pennsylvania, it averages about 40 inches a year. How about a cold forest? It's cold. What's its rainfall like? Depends on the location. Some of them it's very little, but then you have places like the rainforests on the coast of
Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, Pacific Northwest. It rains a lot, but they're cold. Any idea of what these forests are?
Redwood on the left here.
Sequoia National Park. And then that one, not, right? The second one is northern Wisconsin second growth forest. So we have an old growth and a secondary growth forest. An old growth, your textbook uses the number of not been cut in the last 120 years. When I learned it, though, in undergrad, old growth for my professor was defined as not cut since American settlers arrived. So you'll learn that different people in forestry work have different thresholds for what is old growth versus what is not. This is a look at the ecosystem services that are provided by forests. Some of these we talked about. Energy flow, chemical cycling, wildlife habitat, water storage and purification, carbon storage, soil erosion control, climate moderation, all of that. These are the services that are provided by forests. And then they do provide us with ecosystem services. One of them is problematic, though. Livestock grazing in a forest.
I was just going to ask about that because it doesn't have to not be a forest anymore for livestock.
We're going to get there because it's not a good forest if you're grazing it. And this gives you an idea of what would be found in a tropical rainforest, and the concept that a tropical rainforest does have that multiple tiered canopy system with different types of communities on each level. This is showing you what a temperate deciduous forest looks like in its rain and temperature profiles. This is your coniferous forest, so your cold forest. We're going to move on to grasslands, which are areas where trees don't grow. A lot of grasslands cannot support tree life easily. There's something about them where the trees do not survive well. Why might you think that is? Soil problems?
Maybe the weather makes it hard for trees to grow.
There's pretty significant seasonal drought. It's easy to survive if you're a grass, not very easy to survive for all of the tree species. There will be some large trees found here, but they tend to be few and far between. So there's not enough water stored in the soil to support a large variety of many trees. There's enough to support some tree growth, but not the type that we see in a forest area. Also, grazing keeps down the trees. Grazing by large herbivores supports grasses, but not trees, because if the seedlings just keep getting munched down, you're never going to get a large amount of trees in the area. And then fire plays a role. Grasslands do have occasional large fires. Grasslands tend to be found in the dry interiors of a continent, and we divide them into the tropical savanna, and these are their rain and temperature profiles. Mountains are not their own type of biome, perhaps, but they do affect what biomes are found on them. They make up 25% of the Earth's surface, and where a mountain is, you tend to have a large, fast change in altitude, slope, soil types, vegetation, rainfall, temperature, in even really small areas. So you find that your ecosystems here live on a gradient. Most large mountains have snow or ice or glaciers at the top, some of them permanently year-round, have these even in areas we wouldn't expect. Did you know that there is snow and ice year-round in Arizona? On the tops of a few of the mountains. Mount Lemmon is the one outside of Tucson. I've been up there in the summer when there's been snow, where it's 103 degrees on the land surface in the valley. You go up the mountain and there's snow. Seems crazy that there'd be snow in the middle of an area that should be a desert. But it's there. That brings us to deserts. Deserts have low precipitation, uneven precipitation, meaning that they usually have a couple of large storms and no other rainfall other than that. And how much rainfall is our cutoff for something to be a desert?
Is it 40?
Less than 30 centimeters a year.
Usually 20 or 10. So we're talking, we get 40 inches. Can you imagine if you lived in an area that got like 5 inches of rain a year?
Oh, it's in inches. It's in inches.
I usually think about it in centimeters. I usually think about it as less than 20 centimeters. So that's less than 10 inches of rain a year. How would you live? Where would your water come from? These guys differ in temperature mainly, not really in precipitation. The tropicals hot and dry. The cold are cold and they have warmish summers. The tropical or the temperate ones get the most rainfall, and their temperature tends to stay mostly regular. We find that in the tropical ones, there's very little biodiversity. The temperate deserts are full of cacti and specialized animals that can survive in almost no rain. And the colds tend to be very sparse in their vegetation and their animals. Or the animals that live there have to hunt for food elsewhere. The soil here, it's not complete. It never gets to that mature stage. There's not enough biodiversity to get there. There's not enough rainfall to get there. The organisms might spend most of their days in hiding. And your wildlife that lives here is going to have some specialization that allows them to hold on to water. Whether it's the hump of a camel or it's the animals that can hibernate 10 months out of the year and only come out when it rains. They're going to have some modification for desert life. The ground squirrels that live there use their tails as shade. They put their tails up over their head during the middle of the day in order to decrease the amount of evapotranspiration from their bodies. And biodiversity tends to be low. So when these areas are disturbed, they take a long time to recover. And this is what a tropical desert is like. Temperate desert. And a cold desert. What kind of camel? It's Bactrid, right? It's 2 humps. I think that's right. Okay. You all covered succession really well for those of you that have had ecology. What is the difference between primary and secondary succession?
Primary is like no life, like a parking lot or like lava.
You're down to like bare rock and you're starting over.
Yeah.
Secondary is when there's some soil still left. We find that when ecosystems change, when you go from one type to another, or when they change due to succession, the climax community that you get, there's some role that chance plays in it. Because the things that get there are what are capable of surviving. And not everything is going to get there. We used to think that this wasn't true, that chance didn't play a role. But we're discovering, especially as we do restoration work, that chance plays a huge role in determining what is capable of living in an area. And invasive species will play a role too. Invasive species are species that come into an area and become established when it's an area where they are not from. So they're usually introduced. They're also called exotic species. And they tend to crowd out the native species and thereby decrease the quality of the environment.
Can we say that about deer though?
No, because they're native, but they are out of control. Because here they have no predators. This is showing you secondary succession. This is showing you farmlands that have replaced. And we're going to look at some of these. This is kind of a summary figure of human impacts, but we're going to look at them more up close and personal. So, you all told me a little bit at the beginning. Actually, I think you told me all this at the beginning. We have changed the earth. We've made massive changes to the earth. We've taken prairies and we've turned them into agriculture. Our ecological footprint is 1.4 times the size of the earth. By 2045, it's going to be twice the size of the earth. That's bad. We cannot make another earth. We can't even effectively move to the moon, which if you look back at things from like the 1970s, they'd have been convinced we would have done by now. Or we'd be living underwater and everything would be fine. We're degrading the land. 60% of the land worldwide is currently degraded in one form or another. Deforestation, desertification, meaning turning something into a desert. Soil erosion, overgrazing, soil salinization. All of those things are degrading our land remarkably. And as we take what we need from the earth, we're compromising the ecosystems we're taking it from. Yes, we need firewood. Yes, we need paper. Yes, we need lumber to build houses. Sure, we need crops. We need food for cattle. We need minerals in order to make new electronics. But can we do so in a way that is sustainable? Because we're not currently doing that. Deforestation is easy to define. Loss of forest. Removing forest from an area. Removing usually large expanses of forest. Are any of you aware of crops that we're currently growing in areas that we have deforested? Corn and wheat we tend to take the grasslands to grow. There's a big one right now that people are finding to be very controversial. It's not done in the United States. Palm oil. If you look at how many products contain palm oil, you will be shocked. And we are destroying tropical forests in order to make palm oil. And we are putting a large member of the primate family into an extreme amount of endangerment because of it. Does anyone know what primate this is? Orangutan. We're threatening what little habitat they have left in the wild by growing palm oil. There are companies that are growing sustainable palm oil. And if that's something you're interested in, you can check online and find out which companies use sustainable palm oil and which use palm oil from areas that is affecting orangutan populations. Sometime if you get bored, just read the food labels to see what all contains palm oil. One of the shocking things that contains a lot of it is chocolate. Human settlements. Over the past 800,000 years, we've removed about 50% of the world's forests. Most of it, really, since the 1900s. By 2030, we might remove another 40% of what's left, not leaving us with 10%, but leaving us with 60% of the 50% that's currently around. That should scare you. But the problem is, you and I cannot, under any circumstances, go to a foreign country and say, stop cutting down your forests. That's not okay. Because when we do, we are the mean, judgmental American who chop down all of our forests and then comes to tell somebody else they can't do it. It's not working. So we need to start thinking how we redo how we handle it and how we partner with other countries to keep them from doing deforestation. Mining. Firewood. Other uses. Forests can, however, go through succession and come back. We might not always get the same forest we started with, but we get a forest back that can still provide ecosystem services. But continued deforestation disturbs this. One of the things that we've done in the United States and in a lot of different places are that we've done very systematic forest management processes. So if you have an area where you cut down wood for timber, there are certain areas that you go through every year and you cut down this region and then you replant so that by the time you get back there, there's still some mature forest in the area. We do the same thing with areas that we cut for paper and other things. We're starting to realize that we can't just cut all of the trees in an area. It doesn't work. And we're finding that now that we know this, we're also partnering with other countries to help them manage their forests better. We're seeing fewer original forests cleared now and more secondary forest cleared now, which is actually good. But this is what deforestation might look like. This is where that picture can speak more than seeing it, perhaps. And they're clearing it for farms, for houses. But you've all learned at some point in time, tropical rainforest soils are really bad for cattle and farming. It doesn't work. You might get 5 years of soil fertility out of it if you're lucky. This is also a look at deforestation. But you don't just deforest in it. Well, you don't just deal with deforestation. You also deal with degradation of forests. As you start removing the trees from an area, the amount of water that soil is able to hold on to decreases because the amount of sunlight it's exposed to increases, increasing evaporation rates. And this usually starts because we start building roads. As we build roads, we fragment our forest, which makes it harder for things to move from one area to another. The road then provides a pathway for diseases, insects, and invasive plants. It's a highway for them to move in. They move down the road corridor. And once the roads are there, we can go in anywhere and start removing trees. It also provides access for people to start doing farming in these areas. If the land is kept as a forest, well, sometimes we can manage it well and do high extraction, where we're removing lots of trees, but removing them in the right way so that the forest remains intact. Sometimes you try to manage it and you've got to bring in non-native species in order to do what you're doing in the area, like growing palm oil products. And managed forests may be intensively managed so that they're never able to provide the same ecosystem services because it's all about what you can grow on the area. As soil dehydrates, it dries out and it's blown away, washed away, and you lose soil. As the forest degrades, you have less biodiversity, decreased water storage, and less of an ability to modulate climate. So we're going to continue talking about land degradation. What do you all see happening in this picture? Deforestation. So we have this highway being built that's causing deforestation. What other things are happening?
They put in farm plots and then grazing plots.
So we're taking a forest and we're making it agricultural areas. Are you familiar with the word fragmentation? So when you take a large ecosystem and you start cutting it up, what's left over are fragments. When you fragment something, portions of it no longer exist. And each of those fragments exists separately from each other. Imagine for a moment that you are a, let's go with a large cat that lived in this forest. Could you still potentially get from one place in the forest to the other, from one side of the road to the other? Maybe. What if you were a sloth? Do you think that would work as well? I'm seeing some shaking of the head. No, absolutely not. And let's make it one better. Let's say you're a tiny little grasshopper. Is that going to work? So fragmentation is bad for the environment because it cuts everything up. but it's bad for the organisms that live there. It's also going to decrease cross-fertilization, cross-pollination of the plants in the area, and it leads to the development of what are called ecotones. Ecotones being small, different types of ecosystem communities within the same larger ecosystem, each one slightly different from the other. It's going to decrease overall biodiversity of the area. And fragmentation also increases something known as edge area. Are you familiar with the concepts of edges or edge effect? So what's bad about edges? Or then what's the edge effect? I saw a few of you nod your head. Yeah, we talked about that before.
I know like a lot of animals are like drawn to edges.
Some animals are drawn to edges. Some are drawn away from them. So when you fragment something, let's imagine we have a forest that's 100 square miles. And we cut it up into 4 fragments. And we're going to leave one that's 40 square miles. And then we have one that's 5 square miles, one that's 10 square miles, and one that's like 25. We've lost a lot of area because we fragmented, we've put other stuff in there. Our 40 square mile forest, does that still have a lot of area that's considered interior? If it's a big round area or a square area, it probably does. Because when we look at an ecosystem, we talk about edges and interior. Interior is what is found on the inside. It's isolated from the edges. It does not have the blending from one ecosystem to the other. It is fully, in fact, that ecosystem. The edges are where the ecotones are and where you see the mixing of ecosystems. So where you have agricultural land or a road bleeding into the forest. And the edge effects deal with the things that happen on the edge moving into the interior. Deer, I guess. Where do deer browse? At the edges? Sometimes inside a forest, but are you going to see a lot of deers in a forest eating or along the edges or in an area with a lot of shrubs and tall grasses? Where do you think you're going to see them?
I mean, it all depends on like mass of that forest. Like if there's like oak trees in the middle in the interior, then they'll be drawn to the interior. But if there's edges that just got cut, especially, that means it's going to be fresh, like buds and stuff on it.
So it's going to be a perfect
so
area.
Gonna walk the edge.
So edge can determine what animals and plants are found where. What we find is that there's a high level of disturbance at the edge. And not everything that thrives in the interior can thrive in the edge. Deer can be somewhat, well, pretty adaptable, as can squirrels here. But not everything else is adaptable. Things that require interior habitat can't thrive on edges because there's human disturbance constantly. There's other things nearby, and they've lost some of the species that they're used to thriving on. We also find that edges tend to have higher levels of pollution, higher levels of human interaction. They tend to be converted into other ecosystems faster, but they also have the highest level of invasive species growth. Because invasive species thrive in areas of disturbance. When an invasive or an exotic species becomes established, if there's a lot of disturbance, the whole ecosystem is stressed. The species gets in there, and if it's capable of growing, it's going to grow fast and it's going to start to take over. Think of an invasive species as a cold. Do you get a cold when you are stressed? Or do you get sick when you're stressed? More likely than when you're not? Absolutely. The same thing is true of an ecosystem. Something unhealthy that's not supposed to be there is going to take root much faster when there's stress in the system already. Because if there's stress, it means that there's a role that it can fill, a place where it can grow, food that it can eat, if you're talking about an animal. So your edges aren't interior. They don't serve the purposes or the services of your interior. They're prone to more human disturbance, more pollution. They're prone to far higher levels of invasive species. And it's a problem with fragmentation.
Can you give an example of an invasive species?
Certainly. The first one that comes to my mind is Phragmites australis. Do you know on Thomas Drive where there's a little bridge, and you look and there's these plants that are these tall reed-like things, but they have what looks like weed at the top of them? That is Phragmites australis. Phragmites australis is a very strange plant. It exists. Oh, who's had genetics? Let me throw a word at you. Do you know this word, haplotype? So a haplotype are things that are genetically identical, but physiologically different. They don't exist in animals. They exist in plants. And there's two forms of Phragmites. There's an invasive haplotype, which I believe is haplotype M, and there's a native haplotype, which I don't remember the letter for. We don't know where the invasive form came from. Rumors say Australia or Asia, and it invaded Europe before it invaded North America. The native form of Phragmites australis grows to be less than 3 meters tall, usually less than about 2 meters tall. The invasive form of Phragmites grows well over 3 meters in height. Genetically, they're the same. They do not interbreed. They grow the same way. But Phragmites australis invasive haplotype outcompetes native vegetation in a way that the native form does not. No one knows why. They're very hard to tell apart. And in case you're wondering, why don't we just kill it? Phragmites australis survives being mowed down, burnt to a crisp, and then herbicides and pesticides both applied to it, and it can grow back the next year. Because it's a rhizome plant. So rhizome, there's the main stem underground, and it stores massive quantities of carbon and nitrogen there, so it's capable of regenerating from this rhizome. Have any of you ever tried to pull clover out of your lawn, or like the little tiny strawberry plants? You haven't, sometime you should try. You'll see that as you pull it up, you see the rhizome as it pulls from all different portions of your lawn as you're pulling it up. It's really cool. Phragmites does the same thing. Also, if my preliminary work is anything to show on Phragmites, which we still need to rerun everything, someday when Eastern gets a better greenhouse and I can rerun this, it'll be awesome. It appears that Phragmites is capable of recycling nitrogen from its own plant tissue for further growth. I did work with nitrogen isotopes, and we found that the newer portions of the Phragmites plant contained lighter nitrogen, so it fractionates the nitrogen, and it moves nitrogen 14 but not 15, and contained higher amounts of nitrogen than the older leaves that were on the plant. So as it grew, it appeared to be self-cannibalizing its tissues, which changes our complete understanding about its physiology. Published, but not in a journal yet. Very preliminary results. Crazy plant. Here's another one for you that is beautiful. Purple loosestrife. It's pretty. People started planting it as an ornamental plant in their yards, but it's invasive. It gets into wetlands and it takes over. Multifloral rose, right?
Yeah.
We have that one all over campus, don't we?
I think so. We had it in my high school.
There's a Japanese honeysuckle. There's the kudzu vine. Darn, I don't have a picture of it. The kudzu vine can grow up to 6 inches in a day in the correct environment, which thankfully we are not. Bad news, Southern United States is. We brought in kudzu because we wanted to control erosion. And it's a great plant for doing that. But it takes over and it gets big. Many of the vines that you see growing around the tops of our trees out here are invasive plants. And it's not just plants that are invasive. Oh, I should mention, Phragmites we started using. It's also wacky because it grows in freshwater and saltwater. The seedlings don't go well in saltwater, but the seedlings will attach at freshwater and then grow by rhizome down the marshes. And they'll grow at the edge of salt marshes and then grow inward. We brought in Phragmites to use because it's capable of taking out heavy metals from wastewater. So we used it at wastewater treatment plants, and then it would get washed downstream from there to other places. Bamboo can be considered invasive in some areas. People plant it as a fence. One of my aunts has bamboo at her house, and that was one of the things like she had to disclose in selling her home, is that it did have this bamboo forest that they didn't grow. The people next door to her grew it on the other side of the fence, and it spread, and it was just taking over part of her backyard. And she was like, good luck killing it. But there's lots of other things. Later we'll talk about this. Ballast water transport brings more invasive species. So when a ship fills up its ballast, it does this at a port. It takes on water from a port, and it's then going to use that water to balance itself as it transports a long load across an ocean. So it picks up water in Japan. It dumps the water in LA or Seattle. So it's taken water and whatever's in it from Japan and dumped it someplace else. Let's see, there was one study that found almost 400 species of organisms in the ballast water when it arrived in the West Coast. Even if 1% of those species is capable of invading, well, surviving and then invading, that would mean that every shipload, 4 species are capable of it. We've seen species of crabs that have been introduced on the shores here, coastlines here. The Asian shore crab and the green crab are 2 invasive crabs. They've displaced considerably the native crab species, and they are not as easily caught in things by seagulls, and then it starts to move up your food chain. So your plants like Phragmites and purple loosestrife and multiflora rose do not make as good of a contribution to the animals and the ecosystem in the area. So you see a little bit of degrading of ecosystem every time you get a new invasive species in. And the more you get, the less that ecosystem works the way it originally did, and the less it resembles your original ecosystem. So fragmentation makes smaller ecosystems. It gives us more edges. It brings us more invasives, more disturbance, and less value. Is it a good thing? Not really. It might be good for humans because here we're growing food. But for that land to be doing what it's supposed to be doing, that land can't possibly do its normal job. So that portion of that ecosystem has become degraded. Do you see anything different about this example? So here we've clear cut everything. Okay, sorry. So this is showing 3 different harvesting methods. In the top one, have we fragmented it in selective cutting? Not in the same way. So in selective cutting as a method of caring for forests but still taking wood, you go in and you cut some trees. In all of the areas, you cut some trees. So then every area of the forest is going to have seedlings through mature trees. What this is generally going to allow a forest to do is help to regenerate itself. It helps to increase biodiversity, and it keeps the soil in place. In picture A, we have a clear stream. We have a healthy looking stream. We also have lots of different trees. There's going to be lots of food, lots of habitats, lots of shelter. That's a good way of doing forest management. In the second one, clear cutting. That's what we saw in the last picture. Come in and you cut everything down. Are there any trees? And I'm sure you all know this, if there's no trees, is there much of anything else? And check out the stream. Why is it muddy? There's nothing to hold your soil. There's nothing to hold your soil in place. So when you cut the trees down, all of the roots which are holding the soil in place are going to die too. So then you get massive rates of erosion, your streams get muddy, and what do you think that does to your aquatic organisms? Your fish gills get chock full of mud, and a lot of your aquatic invertebrates are going to die, which is not going to leave food for other things. And then we have strip cutting. In this one, it's separate from selective cutting because instead of randomly cutting, you're cutting swaths of trees or paths of trees. It's kind of somewhere in between with its environmental impacts, but it's much easier to do from a human perspective because it's a lot easier to go in and clear out a whole area and then the next year do a whole new area rather than randomly going in. It's easier to manage project-wise. It's cheaper to do. So we frequently see that strip cutting is done in areas where it can be done in the United States. Selective cutting tends to be a lot more environmental. Do any of you know people that own Christmas tree farms? They use selective cutting, right?
Yeah, it looks like it. I don't like know them personally, but like my friends and neighbors is, so I see their yard all the time, like their farm.
So you see these nice areas of like mixed different heights of Christmas trees. A lot of Christmas tree farmers will do the selective cutting, and they will be able to say either that or they'll do a combination of selective with strip cutting, where they will have different plots that have different mixed age assemblages. So they'll say, okay, well in year this, we're going to cut from these few plots. So it's like a combination of the two. Both of those methods are a lot better than clear cutting when it comes to forest management. And there are ways that we can use the land for our purposes without degrading it for the ecosystem it supports. And that's something we need to do.
I'm just curious, so with selective cutting, like obviously, you know, strip cutting has like all the edges and everything, so selective cutting would be superior, but like since you're taking from the entire ecosystem, does that just disrupt it, the whole thing, or is it like a low enough level that it's kind of able
It's usually the second one that people assume that because you're only having a low impact over the whole thing, that's actually better. Because the amount of degradation is so much lower because it's so spread out. Having said that, there are people that say that they absolutely disagree with that, and that's why they recommend strip cutting. Because if you're going to have a low level, at least put it all in one area. So it sometimes it depends on your management strategy and your belief set. Because there are people that are equally educated, equally concerned about the environment that advocate for strip cutting over selective cutting every day. Because they say that I'm not disturbing the whole system all the time. I'm only disturbing one portion of it. And depending upon the trees that you're doing and the forest you're working with, strip cutting might be a lot better. And with strip cutting, one of the things they might do, this one does not. There are areas that are uncut, but sometimes they will leave an area of trees, especially next to a stream, completely uncut so that it decreases soil erosion. Or they may say that we're never going to cut the trees that are on these horrible slopes. And selective cutting usually doesn't cut trees that are on horrible slopes either, because if you disturb them, the amount of erosion potential is huge. And also, safely removing those trees puts their workers at risk.
So, I guess it's just my curiosity with strip cutting. How well does the environment go and respond to strip cutting? Is it usually able to go and sort of regenerate itself over time?
Think of it as always bringing it back to secondary succession.
Okay.
Some of them, strip cutting is combined with purposeful replanting, or at least reseeding of an area, so that it's not entirely random, so that you can say, okay, well, as we cut, we're going to come in next week and we're going to plop in a whole bunch of seedlings to get things started. So it can be managed fairly well. And maybe they won't plop in seedlings. Sometimes people that do strip cutting could have like a greenhouse or something where they're growing things so that they're not putting in trees like this. They're putting in trees like this that have some sort of a root mass.
Sorry, this is like a little.
No.
But I'm just curious if there's anything out there about like if like the forest that has regenerated itself, or like if people plant the trees to regenerate? Like, do they end up with the same results, like the same ecosystem, or does it, when we come in and plant the trees, does it end up actually being more?
Yes. And no. Are there studies about this? Absolutely. And you can find studies that will go, I don't know with forests especially. In restoration, what I've worked with a lot are more wetland studies. And you can never really get back the community that you lost. But it doesn't mean you can't get it back to a healthy community that serves basically the same purpose. Does that? Will it be the same assemblage of species? Probably not. But as long as you're not dealing with animals that are super selective and only eating one specific type of tree, well, usually not, then you're fine. Does anyone remember what Kirkland's warbler eats? I think it's from jack pine only, or something like that. It only eats the nuts, or the pine seeds from a specific type of pine tree, and unless you have that tree, you can't have a Kirkland's warbler. They're found in Michigan. So if you were working in that area, you would have to be sure you replanted those. But if it's an area with a mixed assemblage of species anyway, you could probably mix it. Would it get the same proportion of the different trees you started with? Maybe not. But I don't know that that matters. How many of you learned that forest fires are bad? How many of you learned that forest fires are bad because Smokey the Bear told you so? Fires are not necessarily bad. Forest fires are good if they're a surface fire. So we have, or a vantage fire, potentially. We have three main types of forest fires. A surface fire and a crown fire are very different. The top picture is a surface fire. The bottom picture is a crown fire. In a surface fire, it is just burning through the leaf litter. It's burning through what is on the surface of the forest ground. It's going to burn up some of your ferns, potentially some of your seedlings, but it's mainly going to burn up your leaf litter. But it aids in succession. Some seeds only germinate after being exposed through fire. It allows for minerals to be released better from the soil. It helps to control invasives. It helps to control fungal diseases. So surface fires are good. We generally don't let forest fires burn though, which means that we get a lot of crown fires now. A crown fire is one where it is basically through the entire forest structure. It's up through the crown of the forest, so you're burning everything, including the trees. In a surface fire, your large trees don't really burn. They might get scalded. They may have burn marks on the outside of the bark, but it's not burning their roots. It's not burning through the tree itself. So the trees survive a surface fire. Why do we get more crown fires now?
Maybe like since the leaf litter isn't getting burned and you just have piling up, once it catches and you have so much of it, it's just gonna spread.
How many of you have ever been around a campfire at some point in your life? Everybody? All right, great. So I'm gonna give you two options for a campfire. Here's this like little tiny one, and I've got about this much tall of sticks. And it's on bare ground and there's rocks around it. How long do you think it might burn? It's like this. A couple hours, if I'm lucky. Now I'm going to give you another fire. It is the size of that table, but imagine it is a circle, so that's the diameter of it. And it's about this deep in leaves. How long is that fire going to burn? How hot is it going to get? comparatively to this one, a lot hotter. So the problem becomes a lot of leaf litter. It's going to burn longer. It's going to burn hotter. It's going to burn higher. With a surface fire of this much leaf litter, it's going to burn through quick, and it is gone. It is over. It's gone through. It's used up all of its fuel. It hasn't gotten up through to the leaves on your trees. With a lot of leaf litter, we see the opposite. There's a lot to feed the flames. There's always oxygen because these are outside, but there's a lot of other fuel feeding it. When we stopped surface fires, we found that crown fires got worse. And if you have an area that hasn't had a surface fire in a long time, it is ripe for a crown fire. Managed fires are separate. These are fires we set. I mentioned Phragmites, we burn it all the time. Delaware burns Phragmites all the time. It doesn't work well, but it works better than nothing. It's more effective than herbicides. When they do, they have the fire department there, all around. They usually have a fire boat in the water if they're burning it along the coastline. That way, when they set the fire, and they've usually cut around some of the edges so that it can only go so far, and they dig fire trenches around it, you set your managed fire to burn everything there. We also do managed fires every year out west. Some of you knew Jess Nielsen, who graduated last year. She worked as a wildlands firefighter. If you're ever looking for like a serious summer job that will make you some great cash, working for Washington State as a wildlands firefighter is great. Your hours are going to suck. You're going to have to carry a ton of gear, but you can make good money. They would dig fire trenches. They would set managed fires. We usually call them backfires. This is where you dig a trench, you prepare everything, and then you burn towards the fire. You're trying to burn up all the surface stuff, all the leaf litter, all the fuel, so that before the fire gets there, there's nothing for it to take. California has such horrible fire problems because of our fire control management. If we let the leaf litter burn, we wouldn't have so many houses burning every year. And how are most natural fires set? Lightning. Some forest managers consider that there's a big difference about whether or not you should fight a fire, and you should base that whether or not it started by lightning or whether or not it started by human work. If it started by lightning, let it burn. Tends to be the approach. But if it is started by campers, stupid campers, little children usually, that are not careful with their flames or, I don't know, whatever. People who leave their campfires going, that's different. Those we should fight because those tend to get a little bit more out of control because they tend to be closer to human areas. So some places have a separate management scheme depending upon how your fire starts. You might be wondering, well, why do we have forest degradation anyway? Why don't we just protect our forests? Population growth. We need a place to put the people. And our people are hungry. And they're kind of poor, and the forest area is cheap, so I'm just going to buy it. I'm going to cut down my trees and build a house and do some farming, and it'll all work out. This sounds like a great plan. And then we have government subsidies that allow for this to happen. Not as much here, but Brazil. Lots of other areas that are facing tropical deforestation. The governments are either funding it, giving tax breaks, or somehow not actually fighting it. They're helping to pay for deforestation. And there tends to be a pretty clear pattern in tropical forest deforestation. Foreign loggers, people are going to cut down the trees for the wood product, come in. They've either bought the land, they've paid a fee, or they've paid off somebody, chop down all the trees. Then ranchers come in with their cattle, and they go, oh, great, the cattle are going to graze and eat everything that's left. And then now that the land's been used up, you have some small subsistence farming that comes in, and then when the soil's no good for farming, they move on, and it's bare ground. Eventually, some things grow back, and the cycle starts over. Palm oil, ethanol, soybeans, and firewood tend to be some of the biggest threats to forests, taking wood in order to get firewood or in order to have places to grow those 3 crops. Ethanol itself is not a crop, but we can get it from corn and other things. There are plants that we can get ethanol from that are better plants that produce higher levels of ethanol than corn's even capable of ever doing. Higher quality, higher amounts, better, cleaner burning. But there's a corn substitute, so we don't do it. Desertification. This picture kind of sucks on this screen, and I apologize. What looks like fluffy-ish clouds in the background are sand dunes. And then a few things, and then some farming, and then some more trees. This is not like a misplaced jigsaw puzzle. This is a real picture. Desertification is the result of a loss of soil moisture. When soil loses its moisture, it loses its productivity for the most part, because very few things can live in soil without moisture. In an area where soil becomes a dry soil that used to be a wetter type of soil, we see the productivity of that soil generally drops in half as it goes through the process of desertification. Sometimes this is a natural process. Have you heard of the Dust Bowl? What happened in the Dust Bowl? Here in the Midwest, what happened? Years of drought, right? Years of little rainfall, continuing harsh agricultural work in areas that should have been able to support it. But with years and years and years of drought, the soil became drier. Soil that's drier is also more prone to windborne erosion. And then soil that's drier also gets more prone to waterborne erosion when it does start to rain, because the raindrops actually start pushing that light soil up into the air and away. So you get wind-blown erosion and waterborne erosion when suddenly it starts raining in an area that's been going through drought. Prolonged drought can give us desertification. Human activities can give us desertification. If we divert a lot of stream flow and groundwater flow from an area, we can reduce the water content of that area. Climate change is bringing us desertification. Not here yet. Africa, Australia, they're seeing the results of this. There are areas in Africa and Australia that have been in drought longer than some of you have been, longer than any of you have been in college. Maybe not extreme drought, but there are, this is, I don't know, gosh. If you were to look back at Australia's weather over the last 10 years, it's become very extreme. They're getting lots of heat and lots of dry that they didn't used to have in some of the areas that had a more moderate climate. So they're seeing this stronger than we are. There are pictures online, this would probably be more interesting for you to look for than actually what their weather's looking for, of people taking water bottles and going out on walks and pouring water, and snakes and koalas and things coming to drink from like the water that people have like put out for them. Because there's such drought that the animals are actually going into human places looking. You don't think of a snake needing to drink water. And that for me is what hit home with one of it, that this is like serious, is you have a snake looking for water to drink. Koala, okay, it's very cute when it comes to drink water from the little plate of water a person puts out. But the fact that it's not afraid and it does come towards them enough to do that is weird, because they're not the most trusting animals. They look adorable. They're not going to be your pet. Farming and overgrazing, though, cause desertification. When we farm in an area where we're not supposed to, and we are constantly stripping the soil of its moisture, and we're constantly trying to fix that cycle, we're leading to drier and drier soil. But overgrazing is the bigger problem. When an animal overgrazes an area, it's taking the plant down, that instead of just eating what's on the surface, it's also starting to eat part of the root of the plant. And as that happens, the plants die. When most animals graze, you want them to graze and leave about at least a ½ inch of plant. But when they're eating down to the soil surface, there's not enough for the plant to regenerate and keep growing. So the plants start to die. So you start losing your cover crop on your soil, which means that there's also not enough things going to seed, so your plants aren't regenerating. And overgrazing then eventually leads to desertification. As your plants die, your soil erodes away. There's nothing there to trap the moisture. In arid environments, ARID, dry areas, we see that up to 70% of their soil has gone through desertification. One of the questions we have is this also a reason for refugee status? Can I be a refugee because my area has gone through desertification? How many of you have really dry skin in the winter? Imagine you live in an area that has gone from having soil moisture to an area that now has very little moisture in its environment. How much worse would that be for your body? How much easier might it be to spread some diseases? And what would that do for disease transmission when there's less of a water barrier to your skin? This is showing where the arid and the semi-arid regions are in the world, where desertification is a problem. Unfortunately, the areas where it is the biggest problem are the areas where the people do not have enough food to begin with, and where they tend to be relatively poor. This makes it a justice concern. And this can be the result of overgrazing and desertification in one picture. Do you see the fence? Somewhat protected land, less protected land. Grasslands cannot always support grazing. They can support some, but not everything. Overgrazing, they absolutely cannot support. Because overgrazing is the same as the concept of overfishing, which we'll get to probably later this semester in Module 4 about food. We'll get to overfishing. But it's the idea that you're taking things at a faster rate than they're capable of replenishing themselves.
Does overgrazing happen if the animals don't have enough space, so then they have to eat enough, like down to the
That is one of the reasons it happens. Yeah. Yeah, because, okay, here's my plot of land. I can really support 10 goats. But I can't feed my family and my community on those 10 goats. So I'm going to get 20 goats. So my land could support, maybe it could easily support 12, but 20 is a lot more. And then they start to, and it may take a long time. It may take years before it's a big problem. So one problem is too many animals on too small of an area. Another problem is, especially we see this in the West Coast of the United States and the Midwest, that we have open areas that are federal lands that are regulated grazing lands. People get permits of where they're allowed to be. As long as they're there and they're following the procedures, they're fine. But the problem becomes when people are allotted 100 head of cattle and they have 150. Or when you have everybody from Elizabeth over has their correct permits, their correct things, and they bring in their cattle, and everybody on that side of the room has nothing, and they come in and use the land too. So sometimes it's people that are using it that it shouldn't be. Other times it's coupled with drought, where the land is not being able to support as much growth. So in turn, while it should be able to support all of those animals, it can't. But another part of it has to do with the fact that we've taken large grazing herds that had large areas to move over, and we've put them into smaller regions. So sometimes it does even happen with wild herds of animals.
I was just thinking of, like, I know, like, grass-fed beef is supposed to be better or whatever, but if, like,
In those instances, especially if it's like organic, you should assume that they're taking this into account, but maybe not. And it's worth asking, are your grazing lands overgrazed or not, if you're concerned about it. But usually in those, there has to be usually some level of approval, and you have to keep things at a certain level in order to keep that. Is that?
Yeah, no, just wouldn't it be a concern that if they're trying to have enough land for their animals and they're cutting down trees and making even bigger grazing areas?
Yep. Yeah. And how long does it take to get the correct type of plants to support grazing in an area that used to be trees? Because you can't necessarily just plant ground cover plants, because they may not have deep enough roots and they might not grow fast enough in order to support grazing. Sarah's going to tell you you should all become vegan.
Yeah, I'm like literally freaking out inside right now.
Domestic animals do graze about 42% of the world's rangeland. And if your answer is fish in chapter 4, you're going to see why that is not the answer.
I just have a brief question going back to the desertification. So I noticed how in the last picture where I was showing the areas where there is severe desertification, what I found surprising was that there's like the coastlines of the Mediterranean and even the Somali coast. Is that due to
Climate.
or climate?
Climate.
Okay.
Yeah, very arid climates. Depending upon where the wind hits, it actually takes the water entirely away. It takes the moist air away from there. So it's the maritime winds combined with the mountains nearby.
Okay.
They're in rain shadows. So the mountain keeps the moist air from coming this way. The coastline keeps the moist air from coming this way. So if grasses are grazed too closely, not shockingly, grass dies. Wind and water erosion. Soil becomes compacted because the less water there is in the soil, the more you can squish it down and compact your soil, because there's less things keeping the pore spaces open. And invasive species can come in. Soil erosion we've kind of talked about already. It's defined as the movement of soil components. So it's not just the loss of the rock particles, but also the soil litter, the organic matter, the bacteria, everything that's in there. And your topsoil, as you all know, is the most fertile part of your soil. That's where things are grown. In general circumstances, in normal circumstances, soil is eroding constantly, but it's also being formed constantly. Soil erosion becomes a problem when you erode it faster than it replaces itself. We believe that soil erosion has decreased the world's crop potential by about 20%. So if we didn't have soil erosion, we could grow about 20% more food and feed 20% more people. The US is currently losing soil at 10 times its replenishment rate on average. We're not bad, because China and India are losing their topsoil at 30 to 40 times their replenishment rate. In the top picture, we have soil eroding by water. You see those little stream channels called gullies forming. Over here, we have soil eroding by wind. Soil erosion reduces your productivity, reduces your soil fertility, and it means you've lost ecosystem services. This is where soil erosion is a problem. The white areas are fine. Everyone else has soil erosion problems. Congratulations, we live in the area of some concern, meaning it's not too bad. And this is our last soil erosion slide. This is soil salinization. This is white soil, yes. Soil salinization is when soil becomes salty. It's usually due to the fact that we're irrigating the soil in order to make it wetter, to allow it to grow more crops, to increase soil water content, and we irrigate 20% of the cropland worldwide. 45% of the food in the world is grown on irrigated land. Irrigated water comes from the groundwater. It contains the salts, the minerals, everything from the groundwater that dissolves as the water evaporates. all of those minerals and salts are left on the surface. It starts to cake as salt. How do you get rid of it? You add more water. Where do you get the water from? From the ground. How do you get rid of the salt? You have to bring in water that doesn't have salt. Salt stunts crop growth, outright kills plants, and it lowers the yield of plants grown in salty soil. Next time we're going to do mining.